Firstly, apologies for any background noise. Got nippers next door, but it'll be feeding time at the zoo shortly, so hopefully it'll go a bit quieter. Right. Okay, so today we're focusing on weed management in the production of ornamentals, and just touch on the objectives of today's talk. So really looking how we can best proactively manage weed populations in production, looking at both field and container production, and keeping legal with any label restrictions and EAMU restrictions. So just to sort of expand that point a little more, products either have an on-label use, so something like Flexidor would be an example where it's got on-label use for ornamental crops, or it's something that doesn't have an on-label use, has an extension for authorization of minor use, so that's abbreviated to EAMU. And an example of that would be something like Stomp Aqua, and we'll revisit that herbicide later, well, both of those herbicides later in this presentation. We're going to look at all the current available herbicide options for use within ornamentals production, or certainly the majority of them. Also looking at some non-chemical approaches, both in container production and field production. So nursery hygiene is our first focus. So first point is imperative there, and I'll just read that out to emphasize it. No herbicide program will work without good nursery hygiene. If you've got weeds seeding all around the crop, the best herbicide program in the world will be under immense pressure, and that pressure will sort of not give you the weed control that is possible. So just looking at the picture there, just around the irrigation tank, it's got a cover on, so that'll prevent any weed seeds getting in the irrigation tank and coming through irrigation systems. The non-cropped area around the tank is all nice and clean, there's no weeds there, and that keeps the pressure down on site. And we'll cover how to approach that as we go through this presentation. Within production, keep your plugs and liners as clean as possible, and remove any weeds before potting. Even little weed seedlings are best removed at this stage. Keeping your weed control in your beds paths, non-cropped areas, and the ultimate aim, and I know it's easier said than done, should be aiming to never let weeds set seed. Keeping old stock away from new stock not only helps with watering, but it helps reduce weed pressure, because generally older stock has a higher weed burden. And some nurseries do hold on to stock that's past its best, full of weeds, with the intention of cleaning it up and making it good, as it were, and to sell it. But sometimes this never happens, or that stock just creates a massive weed burden and pressure on the nursery. And always think about the costs of the staff to do that. Sometimes just getting rid of it is the best option. So thinking about production beds and hygiene being the most important thing we can do. We've got woven bed coverings such as Mypex, repairing or replacing any ripped covers, because those are the key sorts of areas where a little bit of compost or bark washes in and weeds take hold. Beds should be well drained, and they should stay clear of liverwort and moss. If you're getting a lot of liverwort or moss on bed surfaces, there may be an underlying drainage issue that needs addressing. And some people are producing on gravel or sand beds which don't actually have a cover on. They can be sprayed with residual herbicides, so Shikara is one that can be used here, and that gives residual weed control for up to 5 months, but it may not last that long in reality. Also, maintaining a dry regime, so not applying excessive irrigation, will help, because that reduces any leaching of herbicides from both the bed, if you put a bed treatment on such as Shikara, or the pots where residual herbicides have been applied to the pots. And also that will reduce weed pressure. Many weeds such as willows that blow in sort of May to July, they require very wet conditions to germinate, and if you're maintaining a drier surface, you will actually help to reduce the amount germinating on the top of growing media. So thinking about some of our residual herbicide options over the crop, Definol being the first one we're covering. The active ingredient is in brackets for all of the products covering today. And this is a good case in point. We're facing increasing restrictions on how we can use products. So this product, we used to be able to use it at a maximum rate of 9 litres a hectare, but it's now been cut to 7. So the 9 litre rate would have probably, well, would have been persisted for longer, but that rate is now illegal. So the maximum rate is 7 litres. And we're also restricted in the months we can use it, given in brackets there in the first box on the left. Now, there is some science behind why the months of use are restricted. This product photo degrades, so in bright sunny conditions it will degrade and not actually work very well. So even in the winter when you're applying it, you need to be thinking about that to get the best from the product. So getting it on a grey, drizzly day is ideal. With residual herbicides, some light rain to wash it in is perfect, really. And if you've got a dull day and no rain forecast, you can always put on a little bit of irrigation to wash it into growing media so it binds into the surface layers where you want it and wash it off the crop. And that's another technique that actually helps minimize any crop damage by washing it off the foliage. I said we can apply them in light rain. We don't want to apply them in heavy rain because that may result in excessive leaching, contamination of watercourses and groundwater, etc. So Devinol controls a range of weeds, chickweeds, groundsel and grass weeds, that gives us poor control of hairy bittercress. So most residual herbicides control a few key species. There's not really anything that does everything. So we typically partner them in tank mixes to get best from different products to control the weeds we want to achieve control of. So the next one we're looking at is Venzar 500 SC, another one that's had its rate cut. We used to use it at much higher rates. So the maximum rate's now 0.4 litres a hectare. Again, this product has a maximum amount that can be applied per area every 3rd year. So if you're applying it every year, you can't even use it at 0.4 litres a hectare, because over 3 years you'd be applying 600 grams a hectare. At this rate, it has short persistence. It probably only lasts about a month. The low rate does give us low risk of damage. So if you've not used it before, you can be fairly confident of not getting damage. Again, for all the herbicides we're covering today, we have got quite an extensive library of crop safety information as to which species are safe or which species get slight damage but grow away from it fairly quickly, and it's still okay to use these herbicides on. And on that point, some people are very nervous about using residual herbicides over crops, and that's normally at their peril because hand weeding is incredibly expensive, at least 30 times the cost of a good herbicide program. And in the 10 years or so I've been working with herbicides in ADAS, I've never seen a crop and nursery stock that's been ruined and written off by residual herbicide. You get some cases of damage, worse on some species with certain products, but they generally always grow away from it, and it's a matter of time how quickly they grow away from it. So by 2 weeks after application, you might see some damage. By 6 weeks, the situation should be improving, and again by 12 weeks, the situation improving more. But some products you don't get any damage, so it just depends. But as I said, we can go into more detail on that in individual cases with specific growers after this webinar, if that's helpful. One of Venzar 500's strengths is it's got activity against mosses and liverworts, other weed species as well, but they're a big problem on many nurseries with overhead irrigation systems. So residual herbicides, again, Flexidor has been one of the mainstays of nursery stock production. Again, we've faced restrictions on its use. So now we can only apply 1 application per crop, which is quite restrictive. Also, the concentration's changed a few years back, so the concentration is 4 times the strength of the previous 125 Flexidor 125 formulation. So if you haven't used it for a few years, be aware of that, because you don't want to be applying it at 4 times the strength, because you'll get more damage and it's illegal. So it's got activity against a useful range of weed species there. Again, we're seeing it's not covering everything, so it's got poor control of willow herb. So this is one that people may choose to partner with, something like Devronol. But then if you do that, you're restrained of using it in those months that Devronol's okay for, as covered just a few moments ago. So dual gold, another tool in the box. We can only use this one in May, just in the month of May, and that's because it's maize herbicide. Traditionally it's under an EAMU, and that's the logic behind it, is all the data was generated for use in maize at that time of year, so that's why we can use it. And it's known to be a problem in water, so generally May's a month of low rainfall. This one can also be tank mixed with Flexidor to improve its weed control spectrum. It's got activity of a useful range of weeds there, some groundsel control, but it's not going to give you total control of groundsel. And just a point on residual herbicides, they work, if just some of the basics, you're probably aware of this, but they work by creating a seal on the soil or growing media, and as weed seedlings emerge and push through that, they're killed. So if you've got established weeds, most of them won't kill them. So before you apply residual herbicides, it's good practice to remove any weeds that you've got, so that you get the best results from that application. Dual gold can cause some slight damage of tips, soft tips, because growth is quite soft in May generally, but things generally grow away from it. Again, can provide more information on quirks of specific species if people require that at a later date. So another one we've looked at in some recent trials is Springbok. Again, another one that's got restrictions. We've got a maximum amount we can apply there, and that's because of this one's a mixture of 2 active ingredients in the brackets there, and it's the metazoclor component that restricts how much we can use, because that's another herbicide that's known to potentially get into water. So by limiting the amount we put on, we're not going to be causing those sorts of problems like when it was used at higher rates and more frequently some years ago. We have got a restriction on this that may mean it's not suitable for people. It can't be applied by handheld equipment, only tractor mounted booms and the like. And then if you are interested in using this one, there are other things to bear in mind. So you can't go in treated crops for 6 days, and then you have to wear gloves for a further 50 days from the point of application when handling the crop. So it might not work for everyone, but it's another tool in the box. There are straight formulations of metazoclor available, and we'll cover that one next on the next slide. But this gives broader weed control than the straight metazoclor, particularly in field production. So it'll give better control of small nettle and crane spills and the like than straight metazoclor, which we'll cover next. So Starwart, just on this one, there's various formulations of metazoclor. Starwart is one that I tend to recommend because it's got no restriction on use in containers. Some of the other formulations do have restrictions on use in containers, so it's a good one to stick with. Can be damaging on soft growth, so it's traditionally used from late summer onwards when foliage starts to harden. So this herbicide is often used on crops that are budded, such as field-grown trees and roses, and it's normally put on as a post-budding treatment on those sorts of crops, often in conjunction with Flexidor. Now you'll know notice I'm mentioning Flexidor use at various times a year. Where we put it in a program very much depends on the crop, because on something like roses, we've got other things we can use early doors, sort of February, that would be too damaging in the growing season, so that enables to hold the likes of Flexidor and this Starwart back for when we can use them in late summer. So just with this product, just to flag up the point, you can either use Springbok or Starwart. You can't use both because they both contain metachlor, and then you would be exceeding the amount that can be applied annually. So with this one, a maximum rate of 0.66 litres can be used annually. So Sunfire, another one. This is one that's good on residual, so preventative use of annual meadowgrass in particular. It's for use outdoor under protection. It's good to tank mix with Flexidor, and we've got one application per crop here. And it does have on label that a few broadleaf weeds are controlled, but it's probably better on broadleaf weeds in the field from experience. In container production, I tend to think of it as primarily a grass herbicide, but you can put this in a tank mix with other things to take your broadleafs, so it's still bringing something to the party. So we've covered herbicides for use in containers there, and most of them have got some level of restriction, and although there seems quite a lot of products to talk about, when you're actually trying to put a program together for a sort of, depending on the crop, 2-year crop cycle, it's not that easy. So we need to be thinking of other things we can do to achieve the best weed control possible without just relying on herbicides, really. So things like applying pot mulches. Some people are using pot toppers, particularly on bigger specimen type stock, immediately post potting. And this is sort of fleshing out our herbicide options. They can help to reduce weed pressure, particularly of the likes of mosses and liverwort that thrive on a very damp surface of the growing media, because they keep back surface of growing media drier. And just flagging up the point, the residual herbicides can still be used with these pot mulches. What generally happens is that the residual herbicide washes through the mulch onto the surface layer of the growing media, and that still gives you a good seal, but well worth washing them in with some irrigation where you're using them over the mulches if there's no rain forecast within a day or so of application, depending on the product. So just a visual example of some pot mulches, so some potting type bark here, and it just shows that it's covering up that growing media, and they can also contribute to a bit of water saving through reduced surface evaporation as well. So various products. This is one called a container mulch from Klasman, and it's got sort of a binding agent, so you can see the pot on its side in the image on the left. The mulch, once it's been watered, it sort of forms a glue and sticks and binds together. So as so often can happen, plants blow over, particularly when they get a bit taller and older. It's kept on the pot where you want it, rather than creating a mess on the bed and not delivering what you want from it. That's one of the product options. Another one is Sinclair Pot Topper, and we included this in some trials a few years back, and it did perform very well, actually. It's wood fibre based, and it binds together, and as you can see, it doesn't fall off when they blow over. The potting image there on the right, and that's another thing to consider. And just a bit more about Sinclair Pot Topper here. So you can see on the top left image, visible weeds where there's no pot topper, and weed suppression with the pot topper. And another thing you may well have noticed, thinking back to a first slide, where there are the weedy pots, the bed is very weedy and dirty, whereas the image below is nice, clean, hygienic production system. So that's really reinforcing the benefits of good hygiene, because it will reduce your background weed pressure. And it also offers some moisture retention as well, so another useful product. Melcourt also do a Ecobar top potter. Most of the growing media suppliers have got a product, so speak to your growing media supplier. If I have missed some out, it's not through any intention, it's just I've just covered some of the more frequently used ones. Okay, right, so that kind of covers container production, so we'll move on to field production. You just excuse me, I'll take my jumper off because the fire's got a bit keen. So chemical weed control in field grown nursery stock, also very important to keep the crop clean. So there are contact herbicides we can use for broadleaf weeds, but most of these have limitations these days. We've lost the things like Harvest and Dicot. Dicot was the active. There are numerous product names that would give us a knockdown and kill of most weed species. Most of these products here have limitations, and I'll just talk through those. So Shark is a product we've got an EAMU for, and the EAMU number's there. Just another point relating to EAMUs, I should have said earlier, but it didn't come into my head. But it's a legal requirement when you're using something under an EAMU to have either a hard copy saved on your computer or as a printed copy in a file relating to the products you're using under EAMU. And that's because they contain information about rates, number of applications that won't be on the product label because it's off-label use. So Shark, it's got some weaknesses. It's not very good on grasses and groundsels. So if you've got those in the mix of weeds you're spraying, they're likely to come through the spray relatively unscathed. Then we've got products like Phenolisan, Calton Gold. They're both formulations of pelargonic acid, and they can have limitations, environmental limitations really, but are needed to get good results from the product. So the weeds need to be actively growing. It probably needs to be above about 10 degrees, maybe 15. It doesn't want to be excessively dry. So there's various caveats depending on which products you're using that are really needed to get success with these products. So it's well worth reading the product label. I mean, the main message with these contact herbicides we're working with today is you can't just grab something off the shelf, whack it in the sprayer and apply it like you used to with things like Dicot, because you won't get a good result. You'll be disappointed. So you need to get all your ducks in a row to get good results with these sorts of products. Another one, Dow Shield, is one that's primarily used for spot treating creeping thistles in field production. It will take groundsel as well because they're in the same family, but you need to avoid drift onto a crop or crop contact with a crop because it can be quite damaging. And that next one down is styrene high load, and that's got an EAMU. It's one to be careful of because in hot weather it can volatilize, which means it can lift and evaporate, and the vapors can damage the crop when it's applied. Weeds also need to be actively growing to get good results from it. Another consideration, you might wonder why there's an image on the right with potatoes. Well, if you're growing on irrigated land, something like roses or field grown crops, potatoes often feature in the rotation on that land, and surprise, surprise, volunteer potatoes are a problem in production. So styrene high load is, I would say, the best product we can apply as a spot treatment to control those volunteer potatoes within the crop. Care is needed for the points I've just made. And then we've got good old glyphosate. Again, various formulations, many of which have got non-edible uses. And one to be careful with, every year ADAS handles claims into six figures, over £1 million, where glyphosate has been used inappropriately. It typically relates to people burning off oilseed rape in windy conditions and then it blowing into normally propagators of soft fruit, so things like raspberries in the field, and there's a big amount, a huge crop value there. But rosaceae crops, so which are important genus in horticultural crops, so things like roses, hawthorn, cotoneaster, they're big important genus. They are very sensitive to glyphosate, and it causes lasting damage, and if a crop has got damaged by glyphosate, it won't generally grow away from it, particularly a rosaceous crop. The glyphosate simply cycles around in the plant system and stunts it and causes bleached, horrible growth, and that crop will have to be written off. So it's just something to be cautious with, and the main message is never to use it near to rosaceous crops. If you've got a field that you're going to grow roses on, for instance, it's obviously a rosaceous crop, but there's a lot of weed before you plant, it would be absolutely fine to burn off with glyphosate before you plant and cultivate, because any residues would have been gone and it won't cause a problem, but not getting it anywhere near the crop once the crop's planted. So grass is another challenge, annual meadow grass in particular. Centurion Max was a product we could use under the long-term arrangements for extension of use. Now, this is the only time these will feature in this presentation, because there's somewhat of a cloud hanging over them. Things that at one time we could use things under the long-term arrangement for extension of use. Basically, they were things waiting to get EAMUs, and Centurion Max falls into that category. But HSE Pesticides have just announced that these arrangements will cease at the end of the calendar year, which the industry is fighting, because they've only given growers effectively 5 weeks to use up these products. Many of the products under the long-term arrangements have been converted to extensions of authorization for minor use, but it's by no means complete, and Centurion Max falls into this category. So if you've got any in store and you've got grass about, it's a good opportunity to use this one up before the end of the calendar year at 2 litres a hectare. But it's hopefully, even if it does drop off after the end of the year, we will get an EAMU for that in the fullness of time, but there may be a gap because it's got to get through regulatory hurdles to get that EAMU. So it's one to watch this space on. And if anyone's used Aramo in the past, it's a similar product to that. So Aramo's long gone, but it's just a similar product to that. So other grass herbicides, we've got Fusilade Max with the EAMU, and a product called Laser. Obviously glyphosate's very good on grasses, but the same caveat applies as covered in the previous slide, nowhere near any rosaceous crops. And I've even had a case of this year of Pitiosporums being damaged. I think probably in the February of 2020 as a liner. I haven't really got to the bottom of it, but I imagine that someone was spraying up the side of the tunnel and it drifted into the liners, and we recovered high levels of glyphosate when the suspected plants were sent for testing, and it's caused stunting and some crop losses. So it's one to be careful of. Okay, so some other residual herbicides that are used in field production that we haven't covered in the container production section earlier in this presentation. So all those herbicides covered previously can also be used in field production. They're not just for container production, but I didn't want to go over everything twice with additional slides. So Sencrex is another one that can be used in field production. It's a very good herbicide. It's persistent, it's effective. It can be damaging depending on the rate, but don't be too frightened by that. As I said earlier, a little bit of damage things will grow away from, and if it saves a fortune on hand weeding, it's worth enduring. It's safe as a dormant season treatment on trees and roses. Now the maximum rate on the EAMU is 1.15 litres per hectare. Now we have trialled that on budded trees and it seems to be safe on those, but we haven't tried it at that higher rate on roses. I suspect that higher rate would be damaging on roses. It's on its own, it won't give you the sort of weed control you need. So with Sencrex, you could mix it with various things. Sunfire, which we covered, the residual for grass, Residual for grass, this is a good one to mix with it because that adds more grass control. And you can also mix it with Flexidor depending on when you want to use Flexidor in your program. It's got a nice flexible EAMU, so it's not limited to one application a year. So if you're not putting on that full dose, you can split your treatments if appropriate for the crop being grown. Another one that's been used for quite a few years is Stomp Aqua. It's effective against a good range of broadleaf and grass weeds. Like most, there's gaps in the weed control spectrum, so this is another one with tank mix with Sencorex Flow. And it's when you've got these tank mixes, everything brings something to the party, and that gives you your good weed control. It's pretty safe as a dormant treatment in various crops. And we can also use this one pre-emergence in treatment as a treatment in seed beds prior to the seedlings coming up. We'd use it at lower rates in seed bed production, and again, depending on the species in seed bed production. So the rate would depend on the species there, and anyone that needs more information, I can provide that. Can tank mix it with other herbicides, as I've said, Flexidor, Sencorex Flow. Just an aside point, fat end's a troublesome weed, and Stomp Aqua is pretty good on fat end as a post-emergence treatment. It's a bit of a get out of jail card if you need it. We've got evidence that it works very well at higher rates than we can use now, but if you did have a fat end problem, you could spot treat them with Stomp Aqua, and it'll certainly stunt them, if not kill them, depending on their size and the growing conditions. Again, you need to consider crop safety in the time of year if you're going to do that, and whether you've already used it, because if you've already used it, you can't apply the product to a ground twice. Another one to think about is Samson Extra 6%. It's a product based on nicosulfuron. It's something we've looked at in trials on Crataegus that have been overwintered in the field into their second year of growth. It seemed fairly safe there. It's got the caveat, it's got to be applied by mid-June. It's more persistent than Dual Gold, so tank mixing it with Dual Gold would definitely broaden the weed control spectrum of Dual Gold. It can be damaging, so just be aware of that, and it's likely to be safer as an inter-row spray. But if anyone's thinking about using a herbicide that they haven't used previously, either get in touch and we can provide more information on what's safe and what's not, or if you're having a look at something on your crop, it's very wise to treat a small area to get some knowledge of how your crop responds to it, and if you do get any damage, and whether that damage is commercially acceptable prior to going ahead and treating the whole crop. Right, I see there's a question flashed up. No, it looks to have gone.
It's okay, David. It's Callum's had to leave. He was just saying thank you very much. So
right, yeah. Right, next slide. So another one that we can use is Goltic 70SC, which is an EMU for ornamentals. It's got pre and post emergence activity, and that would be on small seedlings. Post emergence activity would work best, and it controls important weeds such as grasses and groundsel. So groundsel's a real challenging weed for many nurseries these days. It's relatively short persistence, and it seems fairly safe, but again, try it if you've not got experience of it. And it can be used pre and post emergence of the crop in seedbed production, and again, rates of use would depend on the species being grown there. So just another couple of options, both the same active, so Betanol Flow or Causal SC, they've both got EAMUs to control small seedling weeds within the crop. So if these are typically used where residual herbicides haven't worked particularly well for whatever reason, so ideally you want to apply residual herbicides to moist soil, but growing is never that simple, and if it's a case of apply them to dry soil or don't get them on, it's always better to apply them to dry soil. But where such conditions occur, they don't work quite as well as if everything was perfect and the soil was moist at time of application. So these are quite useful tools just to give you some additional controls where you get seedlings germinating within the crop for those sorts of reasons. It can be applied over the crop. You can get some temporary leaf yellowing, but things generally grow away and recover from it fairly quickly. And up to 2 to 3 applications can be applied depending on the product. But the key thing to work out the number of applications is to refer to those EAMUs, and the numbers are given there in the left-hand box. So just thinking about some alternative approaches, electric weeding still quite novel. It's being developed, but probably if we were thinking about electric cars 5 years ago, they would have been seen quite peculiar to most of us, but now they're becoming more mainstream, and I'm sure will continue to do so. So with the loss of herbicides, electric weeding is something that I think will develop, and it'll be something to consider. The other option, which I haven't covered in this presentation, is cultivations, into row cultivations, etc. But they have their own limitations, because if you're on any sort of sloping site, ornamental crops are often grown in the field on lighter soils, and these are prone to erosion. They're grown on lighter soils because it's easier to lift them out of them in the autumn winter, and cultivations may not be appropriate in many crops. So electric weeding is certainly of interest. It's still in the development phase in many cases, but it's something to look out for, and it may have a role to play in the future. So here's just a bit of information on electric weeding. So an hour post electrocution of dock, thistle and nettle, you can see they're not looking very well, and it's given them a good scorch and burn back, and certainly knocked them back. But more interestingly, what does that look like in a few weeks' time? So here's a photo of 4 weeks on. So we got our untreated controls clearly marked, both creeping thistle and docks, and you can see that we've got a complete kill on the treated creeping thistle, and the dock there is some regrowth, but it's severely stunted compared to the untreated control. Now, as herbicide availability is likely to continue to decrease with increasing restrictions on the number of products we can use, we are going to have to look to more novel type approaches like this. And the beauty of electric weeding, it does give a better result than flame weeding, because flame weeding just scorches the top off and doesn't really damage the roots, whereas the electric current travels down the roots, and that's why this thistle that's been treated is completely dead and the dock is severely stunted. So, and the beauty of this sort of technology is, if you've got a problem area, you could go back and retreat as weeds reflush, and in the case of creeping thistle, you'd weaken the bed of roots and eventually kill it. It is a bit more of a war of attrition than we're used to, but it's a way of controlling it, so it's certainly of interest. So there's a few companies developing this sorts of technology. Here's an example of one of them. And then this is the touch weeder in action. It's quite dramatic, creates quite a bit of smoke, but it does the job for us. And then tractor mounted rigs are being developed. So this is a rig just being trialled in some black currants. Row crop often have a herbicide strip underneath the bushes, so this is being used to kill that vegetation adjacent to the bushes. And then larger tractor mounted rigs, again This one looks like it's been used in sugar beet on the left, and again against a row crop in the images to the right to control any weed adjacent to the crop. So they're an alternative to herbicides. You'd need to make repeat applications to maintain the control, but they've certainly got potential for use in the future. And other countries are already making use of them. Germany is a very green country, and they're ahead of us on this sort of thing. And they've probably got more restrictions on the herbicides that they can use. And they use a lot of soil steaming to kill weed seeds in field production before they particularly plant seedling trees in field grown nurseries. And again, the use of electric weeder here in sugarcane in Brazil. So it's a mainstream treatment over there for them. So just a summary of the electric weeder. You do get this systemic action through the fleshy root, which is very useful. A lower energy consumption than flame weeder, so cheaper to use. Less risk of collateral damage than with a weed wiper. So a weed wiper is typically using glyphosate. So if you get near that on the crop, it can cause lasting and damaging effects. They do need weed control for direct contact with the weeds to get the control. So it does give an option for control where spraying wouldn't be possible because it's too windy, whereas you may be able to go out with an electric weeder in such conditions and not risk damaging your crop. And newer designs are enabling use close to the ground for smaller weeds. That's important for our sector. And field prototypes for agriculture and horticulture are under development. So it's a newer technology, and it'll be something that hopefully becomes more mainstream in the future. And as I say, Zaso is tractor mounted equipment available there in Germany. So just thinking, that's most of the talk covered, but as ever, just keep in your mind how else Tyfu Cymru can help your business. There's one-to-one available ornamental consultancy on weed control and or crop-specific herbicide programs if that helps you. So don't be afraid to get in touch. It's a really good resource, and make use of it. So that's presentation done, and if there are any questions next.
Well, thanks, David, for a very informative webinar. There's a lot to take in there. And as David said, if you've got any questions, please either put your hand up or put them in the chat or question and answer box. So feel free to ask David what you want. If you don't want to ask any questions now, you think of them later, you can always get in touch with Tyfu Cymru, and we can liaise with David then after. So thank you all very much for attending today. We will be posting this webinar on the Tyfu Cymru Knowledge Hub next week. And then there is in the chat box, you will see there is a link to a survey, which we would be very grateful if you could complete. This helps us with the future planning of training for Tyfu Cymru. So thank you all very much for attending, and we hope to see you all soon. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Yeah.